Good evening, everyone. Those of you who I am familiar with, those less familiar. I am Simcha Stanton, as I was announced before, the Rabbi of Kal Hasidim. We are a young shul. We are a very young shul in Bartefeldet, made up of young, vibrant families of many ages, all ages of life, but we're all young and vibrant. We come together every week, we daven, we learn together. Baruch Hashem, we've got a nice kehillah growing together, and I'm happy to have been called to speak, share some ideas with you. It already looks a bit more frightening than it is. I've come up with a chumash, so it looks like one of those kind of shiurim where it's going to be in-depth, difficult, and I should really at this stage be handing out marmakomas to everyone, handing out a source sheet for everyone, but I'm not going to. It's going to be pretty easy. There's nothing deep. I hope there'll be some spectacular ideas that we'll discuss, but I hope, Be'ezus Hashem, there'll be things that are easy to follow, something we can come out with some profound ideas, some insights into the parashas that we're dealing with at the moment. Now, the topic of the shir is Avraham Avinu, Abraham. Really, Abraham can be credited as the founder of the Jewish religion. He isn't, of course, the founder of the Jewish religion because, by definition, the Jewish religion wasn't founded by any human being. The Jewish religion is divine. It was given by God to man, and therefore it's not founded by anyone. And yet, we, even ourselves, would consider Abraham to be the founder. Now, founder is a bit of a pun. It's a play on words, because he founded the religion by finding Hashem. How did Abraham find Hashem? We know that the Rambam tells us, those of you who come to Kal Hasidim on Shabbos afternoon will have heard a little bit of this yesterday, but don't worry, there will be some new insights. The Torah tells us that Avraham Avinu, at the age of 3, the Medrash says, at the age of 3, he started already discovering Hashem. A 3-year-old. A 3-year-old wasn't really capable of the kind of philosophical acrobatics that the best philosophers think of and dream of in the top most enlightened universities around the world. But nonetheless, at 3, he was already thinking. He was contemplating. He was brought up. He grew up in a world, in an environment of oivdei avodah zarah, of idolaters, of people who didn't know about the one God. They were confused. They were confused by all the various forces that the world reckons with: the sun, the moon, the stars, the wind, the rain, all the different forces that even today there are those cultures in the Far East who still live by these forces, who live in service of these forces. And ultimately, they were a confused people. How avodah zarah started, how idolatry developed, is a discussion for another time, but that's the world he grew up in. And as we know, Terach, Avi Avram, Avi Nochoi, Terach, the father of Avram, was in fact the chief. He was the head idolater. He wasn't just any idolater, he made a business out of it. He made a living. He was a good Jewish idolater, you could say, because he knew how to capitalize off the money that there is to make from idolatry. And he sold idols in his workshop. He built them, he formed them, he fashioned them, and he served them. And whatever you want, we've got a children's book at home, like a very contemporary children's book. By the way, if I speak too fast, please stop me. We've only got about half an hour, and I could go on for about 2 hours. So I'm going to take my watch off and have a look at the time. We have a book at home it's called Tell Me the Story of the Parasha. It's a very contemporary, every few years someone else thinks that he has to redesign how children should learn the parasha at home. And I don't know why they weren't happy with the thing that we grew up with, which was probably a more contemporary version of something that other people grew up with. But either way, there's this new book called Tell Me the Story of the Parasha. It's very nice. And the one chiddush, the one new thing that they always try to, whenever you bring out something new, you have to say why your product is better than the previous one. And what's better about this product is that when we were kids, the pages were just made of thin paper, which meant that if you were a bit more of a rowdy bunch, you'd tear the paper to pieces because you wanted to see the book. No, I want to see it. No, I want to see it. And the pages will get torn, which basically meant that we learned to be mannered, to hold books with the right respect and care. And we didn't tear the books. I think my parents still have it. But now in the new generation, they bring out this Tell Me the Story of the Parasha, and it's got not just laminated pages. That was the decade ago. That was version 2. Version 3 has an entirely, it's like a plastic thing that the pages slip into, and it adds up, racks up the price about another €20 or so on a small thin book. And it's totally, impossibly safe. No child can do anything. It's tamper-proof. It's the sort of thing that confidential legal documents should be stored in. And in there, there's these magnificent drawings of Avraham Avinu and Terach as the artist imagines. And you can obviously imagine Avraham Avinu has long payas and a strimel, even at the age of 3. And here you have Avraham Avinu in Terach's shop, and the kind of idols that they have, it would make my Indian neighbor blush. because these idols aren't just an elephant or a pig or something. There's the most grotesque kind of idols with 8 ears and long pig noses coming out. It's brilliant because any child, any Jewish child who, chas v'shalom, God forbid, has any yetzer hara for avodah zarah is going to be totally put off after reading this book. Anyway, that's Avram. He came and he smashed those idols in his father's workshop. Now, what do we know about Avram? We all know, many of us are aware of 2 very tremendous things about Avram. Number one is, as we mentioned, he was a philosopher. At the age of 3, he started pondering. For 37 years, he was thinking, he was considering. Eventually, at the age of 40, he totally abandoned pantheism, he abandoned polytheism, he stopped being an idolater, and he accepted the concept that there is a one supreme being who created the world, and he decided he's going to serve this one supreme being. And then he spent the rest of his life attempting in pre-Torah days to serve this one being. Now, ultimately, it wasn't until a much later stage in his life that Hashem actually communicated with him and spoke his message. So he was pretty much on his own for a while, which is quite impressive. Now, not just that, but according to some sources, some ancient sources, not just Jewish sources, but in fact Josephus mentions, Josephus, who was the historian, he was a Jew, he was the historian in the Roman times at the time of the destruction of the temple, of the Second Temple. Josephus mentioned somewhere in one of his books, I think Antiquities, that according to tradition, and it's not a Jewish tradition this, Abraham, when he traveled on his journeys, he taught mathematics and writing to the ancient world. So he went to Egypt, taught mathematics, he taught writing to the Mesopotamians or something, I don't know. He was pretty impressive. That was Abraham. Another thing we know about Abraham is the exciting part of his early years, which is his battle against idolatry, how he took an axe. Those of you who are familiar with the story, the Medrash tells us, he took an axe and he went into his father's shop and he smashed all the idols to pieces. And then when his father came in, he had placed this axe in the hand of the one remaining idol. And his father walks in and he says, "What's going on here?" And Abraham says, "The idols had a fight." And his father said, "What do you mean the idols can't have a fight?" He says, "Well, what do you mean? Well, how do you serve idols? You believe that these idols have a power, then you must believe that they can fight each other." And obviously he disproves idolatry to his father, who rather than being impressed, was pretty much dismayed with the way his off-the-derech son had turned out. And he went and reported him to the authorities. Now, Hollywood have got hold of loads of good stories from the Torah. They made movies about Noach, and they've made movies about Egypt and the Exodus and all different things, and they've never yet got hold of the story of Abraham. If they did, I want to write the script, because Abraham's story would be it would be an absolute blockbuster. How this guy pondered, you can imagine, the early parts of his life. Maybe he ran away at the age of 3 from his father and hid in a cave and sat there and there's music and he thought about God and dreamed of different things. And then eventually, Abraham the dreamer, and then he goes on in his life and he wanders more and he discovers God. And obviously when he discovers God, there's this tremendous orchestra of music that plays, and then he gets reported, and then obviously somewhere along the line before he gets taken to the authorities, we could invent a battle that we don't know about, but maybe there was a battle between Abraham and some tremendous army of the ancient world, and the kind of special effects you could imagine, and martial arts, and all the different things that Hollywood can throw into a movie. And then in the end, the climactic moment is that he's thrown into the fire, and he survives. Now this would be a brilliant movie because it's a brilliant story. But there's 2 things that we've just mentioned about Abraham that are totally missing from the literal text of the Torah. It's true that the Midrash does tell us about these things. We know about it by tradition. And yet the Torah ignores totally both of those 2 things. The Torah ignores the fact that Abraham was an incredible philosopher who thought about Hashem from his own accord, contrary to the way the whole world thought, against the current. He thought of Hashem, he discovered Hashem, he served Hashem, he even worked out, according to the Medrash, how to perform the 613 mitzvahs without being told. Now that's a significant thing to know about the founder of our religion. And what we also know about Abraham through this midrashic source is the fact that Abraham battled in a physical battle against Nimrod, against the tyrant of the ancient world, and he risked his life to stand up for what he believed, for what he was convinced of, and eventually he's thrown into the fire, and he was saved in a manner that equals or parallels or even trumps some of the greatest miracles that the Torah describes. And yet, neither of these things are mentioned whatsoever in the Torah. And the answer why, according to one idea, is a very profound reason. The Torah is trying to emphasize in the way the Torah depicts Avram. In the way the Torah, as we'll see in a moment, the Torah does, in fact, speak about Avram. The Torah is trying to tell us the things that we're supposed to emulate in Avram, the things that we can and should try and copy. We should try and parallel in our own lives. And both of these two factors, as tremendous as they are, as phenomenal as they are, mean nothing to us in terms of how we can go about reenacting the mission that Avraham Avinu spent his life promoting. Neither of them. Both the fact that Avraham Avinu was a tremendous philosopher who discovered Hashem, who found Hashem and committed his life to God totally of his own accord, and the fact that he risked his life to fight against the cultures around him and ultimately to be thrown into a fire. Both of these facts are not things that we're supposed or can emulate. Perhaps there's some very intelligent people in the room, but I'm willing to bet that the vast majority of human beings, if not everyone today, would not be capable of an entirely independent thought process that leads a person from totally rejecting the philosophy, from totally rejecting the culture of the entire world around him and thinking up something so unique, so different, that it even involves the laws of, according to our midrashic tradition, of meat and milk, of all the various unusual halachas or unusual mitzvahs that the Torah tells us about. We're not capable of that. We're not demanded to be like that. We're not philosophers, and we're not demanded to discover God out of our own intellectual capabilities. We know about God because we're taught about him. And whether we're taught about him from our families or our siblings or our parents or grandparents, or we're taught about him in school, or we're taught about him in a lesson we go to a shia, we're expected to recognize God. We're expected to contemplate him and think about him, but not entirely of our own. We're allowed to ask for help. We're allowed to be taught, we're allowed to learn. In fact, not just we're allowed to learn, we're supposed to learn. That's what learning is all about. Learning is about recognizing, appreciating, finding out things we didn't previously know, and then adopting them in our lifestyle. So Avraham Avinu did something unique, and that aspect, as incredible as it was, isn't something we can emulate. Equally, his Mesirut Nefesh, his ability, his absolute self-sacrifice to be taken to fight against the cultures of the world and throw himself into a fire, has been paralleled, unfortunately, in some of the darker times of our history, the ability to give up one's life to be a Jew, to live as a Jew, to stand up for what it means to be a Jew. But it's thankfully, Baruch Hashem, not something that the vast majority of us are expected to do in a lifetime. And therefore, it's not fundamental to the way we live our lives. It's something to know about. It's something to be inspired about. And in fact, it's something that perhaps gave the genetic courage to those generations, those people throughout our millennia, throughout our history, who were tasked with this terrible decision of your life, or to convert or to change the way you live your life. And they were able to give up their lives, al Kiddush Hashem, and perhaps they inherited this ability from Avram, none other. And yet, Baruch Hashem, it's not something that we are required to do in our day-to-day life. And therefore, although these things are very much part of who Avram was, it wasn't what made Avraham Avinu so special. Neither the fact that he was a tremendous philosopher who discovered Hashem, nor the fact that he gave up his life al Kiddush Hashem, as dramatic as it was, as incredible as Hollywood would have liked to depict it, neither of those things were the things that make Avram so special. So what did make Avram so special? What does the Torah, in its actual black and white text, what does the Torah tell us about Avraham Avinu that we can live by, that we can relate to, that we're supposed to emulate? There's a whole number of things that the Torah discusses, but I want to mention two. One of them I'm going to mention briefly and then come back to, and then the second one I'm going to mention in more detail. The obvious idea that springs to mind when we talk about Avraham is chesed, is Avraham's total dedication to loving kindness. We know how he spent a lifetime looking after others. His very mission to convince others, to connect others to the divine, to connect others and inspire people that there is one true God and it's worth serving him. That very mission in its essence, says the Rambam, says Maimonides, stems, it comes at its root from an incredible love for other human beings. How so? Because a person who loves others wants them to share in the things that he has. If I love you and I have a nice cake, I want you to share in that cake. Avraham Avinu had something that he was so inspired by that everyone around him, he wanted them to share it. Now, if they were his enemies, if the people around him he didn't relate to, he didn't love, he didn't connect to, or didn't want good for them, he would have felt, listen, I can keep this to myself. If I give someone here in the room the lottery, then you might share it or give some of it. I don't know, maybe we shouldn't be too hasty how much we're willing to share of our spoils from the lottery, but we might be willing to share of it with our loved ones, with our friends, with our family. But we wouldn't go up to total strangers in the street and say, I've just won the lottery, here's 25,000 euro. It wouldn't happen. We don't do that for people we don't love. But Avraham Avinu, who loved all human beings, wanted that if I have something special, you should share in it too. So ultimately, the root of Avraham Avinu's love for other people was the fact, the root of the fact that Avraham Avinu gave to other people and gave of his mission and taught other people about Hashem stemmed from the fact that he loved them. He wanted good for them. He wanted that the same divine inspiration or the same reward that he could receive, they would in turn receive as well. That's Avas Hashem, that's Avas Habrias. It's tremendous love for other people. Of course, it's a love for Hashem as well, but it's a love for Hashem that flows over into a love for human beings. And we know Achnosas Orchim, bringing guests into his home, the very beginning of this week's parasha. Vayeri Lov Hashem Be'Eloinei Mamre. Avraham Avinu had just performed the most difficult mitzvah that a person could perform on oneself. Luckily, all of us men were only asked to perform this mitzvah long before we were able to object to it. But Avraham Avinu was 99 years old, and he was told and commanded to do the mitzvah of Bris Milah, and he readily and willingly did the mitzvah for Hashem. And the pain that Avraham Avinu was in was excruciating. And yet, he sat outside his tent and couldn't bear the fact that strangers would come past and he wouldn't welcome them in. He wouldn't give them food. He wouldn't provide shelter, warmth, home, food for them. In fact, the Gemara tells us that this was a very part, it was a deeply ingrained essence of the mission that Avraham Avinu had to promote the divinity in the world. Because Avraham Avinu ultimately would bring them into his house and he'd show them warmth. And we know that the best way to make a person excited is a good bowl of cholent, some kugel and a l'chaim. And that's what Avraham Avinu did. He was the pioneer of that school of thought. He brought them in, he provided them food, a company, a good chat, a good schmooze, and then he told them about Hashem. And that was what inspired them. That was what geared them and turned them on to Judaism, turned them on to monotheism. This was Avraham Avinu. So he had a tremendous love for others, to the extent, what kind of a Jew could do the following? Avraham Avinu, and we'll discuss this more in depth in a moment, Avraham Avinu was told, not far into this week's Hedra, that there was a place called Sodom of infamy. Sodom, that's marked down in the books of our history as a place, the worst, the most evil place that the world ever saw, the Gehenna on earth, the evil on earth. And God decided that the sins of Sodom, the sins of what they had done there, what they were performing, was far too much for him to stomach, for God to take. And he decided he's going to overthrow Sodom entirely and burn them to the ground, and no one would survive except Lot, Avraham Avinu's nephew. That's what God had decided. And God goes and shares. He shares this piece of information with Avraham, totally irrelevant to the fact that God can act and will act without having to consult with any mere mortal, with any human being. But what happened when he did discuss it with Abraham? He tells Avraham he's going to destroy Sodom, and you know what Avraham Avinu says about the most wicked place on earth. They weren't monotheists. These people were serving those idols that we mentioned before, the ones with the 8 ears and fanged teeth and they were the most evil, despicable people on the planet. And when God tells Avraham he's going to overthrow Sodom, he's going to destroy them entirely, Avraham was shocked. He was horrified of the loss of human life. Human life! We're talking about people who had forfeited their right to live. People who were so evil that there was no need for them. They didn't benefit humanity. They didn't benefit this world one iota. And nonetheless, Avraham Avinu felt that the requirement for a human being to have compassion on any human being, because all human beings are created with B'Tselem Elokim, all human beings are created in the image of God, that required him to plead and beg God to have compassion, to have mercy on them. That's the extent of the chesed, of the loving kindness that Avraham Avinu had. Not just for Jews, not just for people who are willing to listen to his rant, to his drosha about God. You could imagine that those people who might not have been interested, many of us, when we want to talk about things and the people in the shul start throwing tomatoes at us, we say, you're a useless bunch of good-for-nothings. But Avraham Avinu was even interested in helping those people who weren't interested in him, who weren't interested in everything that he stood for. That's loving kindness. Now we'll get back to that in a moment because there is more to discuss about this loving kindness. But ultimately, God says to Avraham like this, and this really is the second factor of Avraham Avinu's greatness, of what makes Avraham Avinu so special and what makes him a person that we still want to emulate. God says to him like this, I'm going to tell you what I'm doing in Sodom. And I'm going to preface it with one sentence. There's a sentence in the Torah that's tremendous. This is why I've decided to consult with a mere mortal, Avraham, even though I don't need his opinion, and his opinion is insignificant, and in fact, in the end, with all Avram's pleading, there was no one in the entire Sodom who God felt was deserving of mercy. So his pleading was, in essence, in vain. It was for nothing. And yet God says to him like this. God says rather in the Torah, he says, Ki yadativ, because now there's many explanations of how this pasuk is actually translated, but the simple translation is Ki yadativ, because I am aware, I know, and to know is also to be intimately familiar with someone. Because I am intimately familiar with Abraham. Why do I know him? Why have I formed a bond with him? Because of one thing. Because with everything he does and will do, there's something that stands out. He commands his children and his household after him. They will go on to guard the way of Hashem, to guard the commandments of Hashem, to perform tzedakah, charity, umishpat, and acts of justice. So God says, therefore, therefore I'm going to tell him my plans. I'm going to tell him my plans to overthrow Sodom. In other words, why am I so enthralled by Avraham Avinu's behavior? Not because of anything we've mentioned until now, not because of the philosophy, not because of the Mesirut Nefesh, the desire, the willingness to throw oneself into a fire, not even because of the acts of loving kindness that he himself performed, but because I know that he lives by a message that he'll give to the next generation. I know that he will make it a very big part of his life, and remember this is before Yitzchak is even born. This is before Yitzchak, the promised son, is born. So at this moment in time, he's only got Yishmael. And nonetheless, God says, I'm totally, absolutely in recognition of the fact that Avraham Avinu is a person who will make his life's mission to educate his children, to educate them in the ways of Hashem, that they in turn will also do tzedakah or mishpat. They'll do acts of kindness and mishpat, and acts of justice. Now, the question is, there's two obvious questions that spring to mind when we read this. Number one, how are we defining Avraham Avinu here? We're defining him as a person who not is important or incredible because of all the things he did, but simply because he's going to give it over to his children. Is it not big enough that he himself does v'shomru derech Hashem la'aseh stokah mishpat, that he himself guards the ways of Hashem, not just guards the ways of Hashem, but came of his own ability to the recognition of Hashem, and he in turn does stokah mishpat? Is it important to say the fact that his main quality, his biggest achievement, is he going to give it to his children? And let's say he had failed with his children. Let's say he was an amazing person who did everything right, but with his children he wouldn't give it to them. He would fail with them. Would that detract from the special qualities of Avraham Avinu? Would that detract from his mission? You know, my father brought up a family of many boys. And I can tell you my father's a great person. He's not watching right now, so I have nothing to fear. But I truly, we hold very highly of my father. He's a scholarly person, he's a learned person, and he put a lot of hard work into bringing us up. In some ways, perhaps he was successful. Maybe he was very successful. I don't know how hard it would be to do his job. But in many ways, he couldn't control us. Does the fact that my father couldn't control us in every occasion, in every situation, detract from him being a good person? No, I wouldn't say so. I would say that everyone's human and we can't always control the next generation. I consider myself I've only got 3 little kids. Those of you who know me, I would consider myself a relatively okay father. There's probably more I could do, we could all do more, but I'm relatively okay. Now, yesterday in the Kiddush in Kal Hasidim, I was notified by a very kind person that my son, who's 3, don't report me to the social services, had run away down the road. Yeah, he'd run off. Yeah, we have good security in the shul. We do keep the door closed, but my son's big enough now to open it of his own, and he'd run off. So I went chasing him, and I spent a good 20 minutes trying to bring him back. Does that detract from everything I'm telling you today? Does that detract from the fact that I'm here to teach you something about the parasha, but I can't be good, I can't be a meaningful person because I failed in my son? Surely not. So why is it that Avraham Avinu is personified not by what he did and what he lived for, but by how he educated his children? That's question number 1. And question number 2 is, Avraham Avinu had proven his ability to educate people. Long before Avraham Avinu had left Choron, at the beginning of last week's Sedra, Lech Lecha, he left Choron, he left his family home, his ancestral land and culture, and he traveled. And what we know about him that the Torah tells us is that he traveled not alone, not just with his wife, not just with his nephew, but he traveled with Hanefesh Asher Osu B'Choron. He traveled with the many souls that he had converted, the people he had taught about Hashem, that he had taught about monotheism to, him and his wife as a joint team. They traveled together to leave. That means he had a following. He wasn't just any person. He had a huge, we don't know how many people, perhaps a massive gathering of students, of disciples who lived by his every word. He was their grand Rebbe. And they followed him. He was able to educate them. He had educated them. He taught them everything he knew. He was a fantastic educator. His shiurim were packed. His masholim and his parables that he brought and the way he brought things out were obviously amazing, because he managed to turn people who had never ever heard about monotheism, who had nothing to compare it to, nothing to relate it to, and he turned them on to Hashem. So he was a brilliant educator, a fantastic educator. So why was it so important that he would go on to educate Bonov or B'nai Beisoy? He would go on to educate his own children. Why was it not enough that he had proven the ability to educate everyone? He obviously knew how to teach the word of Hashem, and he obviously was committed and deeply enough strong about what he was teaching that he was able to inspire others. So why was he tasked now? Why was he made special? Why did God say this is what's special about him, that he's going to teach his children? I'm going to answer the second question, then we'll get back to the first question. And the answer to the second question is, and there's two words, and that's it, Meghan Markle. Meghan Markle. That's the answer to the second question. Now, what happened with Meghan Markle? We all know what happened with Meghan Markle. This is an idea that I couldn't have thought of 5 years ago. But Baruch Hashem, thank God for Meghan Markle. She served her purpose in this world, and she's provided us with an idea that we can use to answer up the problem. Meghan Markle married the royal family, but she wasn't from a royal family. She was a celebrity, a TV actress, whatever. Maybe you can fill me in. So Meghan Markle came along, and she married in. Now, presumably, they would have taught her, there's our British royal family, thank you very much, have a lot of protocol and formalities. They're the yekkers of yekkers, the British royal family. And you don't just come into the royal family with your Hollywood bounce and whatever it is and glamour and say, listen, I'm here, everyone, accept me. You have to, we say, need a stell zu. You have to be willing to try and fit into them, not the other way around. If we've got 1,000 years of Saxony history, you don't just come with Hollywood from some trailer park home and say how you like to do things. And Meghan Markle came along, and presumably at some stage, she was willing to commit. She probably said, why not? This is the height of celebrity power. You know, I'm going to marry the Queen's grandson, and he's fourth in line to the throne. Okay, he'll never sit on the throne, but it's still something prestigious. There's people who are 37th in line to the throne, and they go on about it. And she said, this is it, I've made it in life. And they probably taught her how to curtsy and how to talk and how to speak with a "w" instead of a "r," because the Queen doesn't say "r," she says "w." It's something from the House of Windsor. So they probably taught her how to do that, and she went and learned it very quickly. Not long later, she was on Oprah Winfrey. Was it Oprah Winfrey? She was on Oprah Winfrey's show, bashmutzing the whole family, just belittling them, saying how terrible they are, that they're all traumatized, their grandchildren, did a terrible job of it. And she totally left the fold. We're not interested in having anything to do with them anymore. Harry and I have decided there's better things waiting for us in Hollywood. Yeah? So that's what she did. Where did it go wrong? I think, perhaps, although they never asked me my opinion. If they did, maybe I could provide consultation to them at a very expensive fee. But I think that what went wrong is simple. You can't just educate people to do how you want. If the thing you live, the way you live is special, and the way you live is so totally different from the rest of the world, which still today the royal family in England have a certain airs and graces about them, that you can't compare it to how other people live in society. You can't educate people overnight just because she's willing to accept it. It doesn't work like that. To really educate people, you have to start at the beginning. When you educate someone and you try and convince them about something, they can agree because it sounds logically right. They emotionally relate to it. They think it'll make them more famous. They think perhaps that they'll get more money, whatever it is. But there's always some kind of decision-making process why I'm willing to commit to the lifestyle that you want me to live. And the harder that lifestyle is, the more difficult the decision is to make about committing to that lifestyle. Now, what happened with Meghan was simple. She learned about it, they taught her, but it didn't mean anything to her because ultimately it was just too difficult to commit to, and over time she realized that she could do better elsewhere, or she thinks she can. Maybe she made the blunder of her career, I don't know. But that's what she thought. When a person brings up their children, from the beginning, from a very young age, we start to explain, we start to get our children to mimic our ways, even before they can understand it, even before they can relate to it. We don't get our 3-year-old child and set them aside and give them a logical idea of what God is and philosophy and how, well, Avraham Avinu worked it out at 3, so if you're meant to be descended from him, you can do the same. We don't do such things. We teach them nice nursery songs. Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is truly everywhere. And they don't really understand that Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is truly everywhere is actually a huge, deep machloikas. It's a point of contention between the Balatanya and the Nefesh HaChaim and what it means, the concept of God being here, there, and everywhere. We don't tell them all that. We teach them, we ingrain them with Shabbos, with Yomim Tovim, with the fun of Judaism, with all the good things there are. And as they grow up, they inherit it. It becomes ingrained in them. It becomes taught in them from a young age. And therefore, it's that much closer to home. It's right in their heart. It lies inside them. They're able to do the things that we taught them because it's not robotic, but they've grown up with it. It's familiar to them. It's not an alien culture. It's not flipping someone's mind around when they're so used to something else. They're totally one with it from a young age. Is it brainwashing? Maybe. Is that brainwashing? I don't think so, but it doesn't bother me. We do it with everything. We want our children to have a good profession one day, so we send them to school without explaining to them why. We do it because we know it's in their best interest. If we want our children to be musical, we send them to music lessons long before they tell us whether they really would or wouldn't like to go at 6 o'clock in the afternoon after school and all their friends are playing soccer and they're going to play some silly violin. And we do it. And if we want our children to be professional football players, then we jolly well make sure they have a personal trainer and they go 3-4 times a week, 5, 6, to whatever it is, to play football and learn how to kick that ball and bend it like Beckham. That's what we do. It's not brainwashing. It's what we do in the best interest of our child. And of course, when they grow up and they get to whatever, post-adulthood, they turn around to their parents and tell their parents how much you did wrong and it was all wrong and you shouldn't have done this and I resent this and I resent that. And then they go and do the same to their children. That's the circle of life, as Elton John would say. But that's what we do. It's not brainwashing. It's part of how we educate our children. And that's what Avraham Avinu did. And Hashem was aware that ultimately, educating people, educating others, that's very nice. But it's not lasting. We don't know what happened with Avraham Avinu's disciples. We've no idea. I don't know. You don't know. There is no source that tells us what happened with all those thousands of disciples who followed him by his very word. Perhaps their children got convinced of some other Dalai Lama or something somewhere else in Tibet and went off in a different direction. But what we do know is that all of us here are the children of Avraham Avinu, and we're still living by his mission, which means that what was successful, what did eventually bear fruit, was his ability to educate his children. Because when one educates children, one starts from a young age. Now that's point number 2. That answers our second question, why it's not enough to just educate others, one needs to educate one's own child. But it's the same thing to answer the first question. Like we said before, what a person wants deep down is what they're going to give over to their children. What we prioritize in our own lives is what we prioritize for our children. What we firmly and truly believe in is what we want for our children. If Avraham Avinu was a person who did chesed, but after all those years of kindness, he slowly got bored of it, he slowly resented it, you would have known. I'll tell you how you would have known, because he wouldn't have told his children about chesed. If Avraham Avinu had been a person, we have to finish, if Avraham Avinu had been a person who invited all those Arabs into his house, and then at a later stage decided, you know what, they took total advantage of me. I never saw anything from it. I never got paid for it. I never got a thank you. They spat on my floor and walked off. Then he wouldn't have given it over to his children. And that happens often. Sometimes people take on a career, and it's such a difficult career that they resent it when they're later on. And when it comes to their children, they say, don't make the same mistakes that I did. It's not worth it. I invested far too much time and effort into X, Y, and Z. I'm telling you, my son, don't do it. If Avraham Avinu didn't believe in chesed, he wouldn't have told his children about it. The fact that he believed in what he himself did, was personified, was shown, was demonstrated by the fact that it was the number one thing he gave to his children, tzedakah or mishpat. He gave to his children tzedakah, charity. He told them there's nothing more and nothing less that a human being could do than to be a person who acts with charity and kindness to others, a person who thinks of all people, not just Jews, not just our friends, not just our neighbors, but all of humanity, because we're all created in the Tselem Elokim. And that's why the Talmud says that one of the character traits, one of the 3 character traits that a Jew has is goim lechasodim. A person who's kind demonstrates that he's a descendant of Avraham Avinu, whether a biological descendant or a spiritual descendant. Kindness is a demonstration of living the life of Avraham Avinu. And a person who's cruel, a person who doesn't think of others, he's not, unfortunately. That's what's so special about Avraham Avinu. There's so much more to say, but we'll have to leave it for now. What's special about Avraham Avinu is not just the way he did chesed, which the Torah describes in great detail. Not just his love for others and his reaching out to others, even terrible, evil people who he had compassion on, but the way that this was at the forefront of his very mission, his very reason to live, was to give it over to the next generation and ensure that we, generation after generation after generation later, will still be living by that life goal, to do for others, do good for others, and be kind and love each other. Thank you very much for listening. Enjoy the rest of the evening. Sorry.